Any for your thoughts?
Wrap it up, fuzzball.
Hello. Thank you so much for joining us at our Star Wars Dragon Con virtual panel. My name is Jen Reynolds, and I am a professor and associate dean at the University of Oregon School of Law. It's my privilege to be moderating today's panel, Conflict Experts Fight About Star Wars. So as you can tell from this title, I am joined by conflict experts today. Allow me to briefly introduce them. Noam Ebner is a professor at Creighton University, where he teaches in the Negotiation and Conflict Resolution program. He's a prolific scholar who specializes in, among other things, online dispute resolution. He is an expert in all things Star Wars. Noam, it is so good to have you. Hilary Anger Elfenbein is also a professor. She is the John and Ellen Wallace Distinguished Professor at the Olin School of Washington University. Her research focuses on interpersonal processes like negotiation and emotion in the workplace. She is also a semi-professional stand-up comedian. Welcome, Hilary. Sherrill Hayes is yet another professor. He is from Kennesaw State University, where he directs the School of Data Science and Analytics. Sherrill has served as a mediator in numerous settings, from the domestic to the international. He and his kids are regular attendees at DragonCon, so if you're there in person, you might spot them. Great to see you, Sherrill. And last but not least, we have Scott Maravilla. Scott is an administrative judge with the FAA, and he also serves as an adjunct law professor at the American University Washington College of Law. In addition, Scott writes for Law in the Multiverse, Ain't It Cool News, and Latino Review. So nice to have you with us, Scott.
Thanks for having me.
Yes. So all of us actually have just finished working on a book called Star Wars and Conflict Resolution. We are 5 of some 25 authors who contributed to this book. Noam and I edited it. We're very excited to see it in print later this year. For today's panel, we have chosen some topics to address that give more insight into both Star Wars and conflict resolution. I'm going to moderate the conversation between these 4. I hope that things don't get too out of control, but you never know what could happen when conflict experts disagree. So let's start with the basics. All right. So why don't we think about some common negotiation situations or common conflict situations. And when we think about these situations, who from Star Wars would we rather have with us to help out? So let's start with buying a car. So let's pick on you. Who would you rather have come along with you to the dealership if you're negotiating the price of a used car?
Oh, well, when I'm in that situation, I always feel that a major problem is information asymmetry. The dealership, they know everything about this car and what state it's in, how good it is, what it's really worth, and I only know to look at it or, peek under the hood, but I don't really know. So I would take R2-D2 along. R2-D2, literally a mechanic. He'd tell me exactly what state the car is, and then I'd be in a better negotiating place. And if he could plug into the Imperial network at the same time, even better.
Hilary, I was watching you during Noam's answer. It looked like you were shaking your head a little bit. You see it differently, apparently. Can you tell us why?
Yeah, so I'm actually tempted first to say it's ObiWan, because these aren't the prices you're looking for. But it's got to be Yoda. It's got to be Yoda, because look, he's got the Jedi mind tricks and he's underestimated. I mean, look at the guy. He's short and green. The car salesperson, if Yoda shows up, he'll never see it coming.
Let's think about interpersonal issues, like between neighbors. Sometimes people fight. If you were going to have somebody from Star Wars sit down with a couple of neighbors who are fighting, who would it be? Scott, let's ask you, who would it be?
So I'm always going to go with experience. And so I would look to Qui-Gon Jinn because of his successful negotiations and mediation between the Naboo and the Gungans, bringing them together to fight for the liberation of their planet against common enemies.
Sherrill, Scott makes a really good point. Qui-Gon has got that sort of quiet authority. Do you agree with Scott?
Well, so I think I agree in principle, but I'm going to actually give the credit and say that who I would take with me is Padme Amidala instead. So while Qui-Gon might have sort of set up the situation, it was really Padme that was the one who made the decision, right? She was the one that was going to fly back to Naboo. She's the one that went and she actually got down on bended knee in front of Boss Nass, and she was the one who made that happen. Qui-Gon might have given her some motivation to do it, but ultimately it was her that did it, and she was the one who'd been living next door. I mean, I think of the sort of the Gungans and the Naboo were this sort of divided society, right? They were neighbors who didn't talk to each other. They knew they were there, but they kept each other apart. So that's a big ask for somebody. So I think if I was having trouble with my neighbors, I think she's somebody I would want to know. How did you handle that? Why did you do that? What was your motivation, and what helped you internally make that decision?
Let's actually stick with you for a minute, Sherrill.
Okay.
Workplace conflicts.
Oh.
So who would you rather ask for advice on a thorny political fight at work?
Okay, so no spoil. If you haven't seen Book of Boba Fett, plug your ears for a second. But I think for this, I'm going to go for Boba Fett from Book of Boba Fett, and I'll tell you why. Because he inherits. Well, inherits is a strong word. He takes power as the Dayamo, but then he decides he doesn't want to lead the same way that Jabba did. He decides he doesn't want to lead the same way that previous leaders had, and he decides he wants to lead with respect rather than fear. And that's an issue often in workplace situations is how you choose to lead or how you choose to respond to getting a new leadership position or getting a new job. And he took what he knew how to do. He had a lot of experience on that planet because he'd been digested in the belly of the Sarlacc. He escapes. He gets to know the Tusken Raiders. He learns the culture. So he's one of those people who really dove in before he took on this leadership role. Workplace conflicts are nasty, or they can be nasty. And a lot of times it's about who you know and the relationships you develop in the workplace with people. And in this instance, I think Boba did a really good job of doing that, and then taking control of what was a hostile situation. The mayor and everybody else, no one wanted him there. So I'll go with Boba Fett.
All right. Well, so you're making a good point. And yes, certainly, as I was thinking about what you were saying as you were talking, older Boba Fett seems like a good option. Definitely better than younger Boba Fett, who didn't really seem to me to have the perspective to provide more than a, shoot first, ask questions later kind of approach, and kind of a sort of in it for himself, perspective that is not as helpful in workplace conflicts. And workplace conflicts, of course, we resolve them in such a way that people can continue working together. And so there can't be like a lopsided winner and loser in workplace conflicts. I know you agree with this, Sherrill, but it's one of the tricks about that kind of a conflict is that it's hard to get people who are in a thorny situation to that point where they can keep working together. And so I would have said, I respect your older Boba Fett answer, but I think that Maz Kanata would also be very good resource for a workplace conflict, simply because she's seen so many conflicts, and so once you have somebody who is has that much experience, it's always good to get that kind of perspective on why people might be doing what they're doing so that you don't vilify them. But anyway.
Well,
so
we do at one point catch Maz in the middle of a labor dispute with a blaster in her hand.
It's true. Yeah. It's true. Well, flexibility, versatility. Maybe not everything works out. Good point, though. I had just as you were saying, I was like, oh no, there's that
I like
that scene when she's shooting. But yeah. All right. Okay. So let's think a little bigger. So who would you send to a diplomatic summit? So we've talked about used cars. We've talked about, interpersonal things. We talked about the workplace. Diplomatic summits obviously pose some different kinds of issues. And so who would you rather have represent you, your country, your planet? Hillary, let's hear from you.
All right. So hands down, I would send ObiWan. All right, so he's got a diplomatic demeanor, of course, right? And we see how comfortable he is in the Jedi Council. But also, one of the things I really like about him for this role is that he sees others' hidden motives, right? And you need to understand the other party's deep underlying interests in order to be an effective diplomat and mediator rather than just what they say out loud. Last, and really critically, Obi-Wan's willing to put the interests of others ahead of his own interests. He's really focused on the group outcome and not his own needs. And you see this especially in episode 4 at his death, right? Because he puts himself at risk being with Vader at a time when he's basically trying to buy time for Luke to achieve his own mission. So I feel like this is the kind of person you really want representing you.
Okay. All right. Well, so it looks like I'm seeing some faces looking like they agree. We all love Obi-Wan. Hillary especially loves Obi-Wan. She would have him in almost any situation, it sounds like, as her companion.
Well, one name, I wouldn't want Leia to be my representative. She's part of the Rebel Alliance and a traitor.
Well, let's change gears. Let's zero in on Anakin. So in our book, the single most popular subject of analysis, this is not surprising, was Anakin. Noam, I would love to get your take on something. Anakin seems to find himself in fights all the time. Is that just because he's bad at managing conflict?
That's not how I would put it. Rather, I'd say Anakin, like all of us, has his own default mode of responding to conflict, and we're all wired differently regarding conflict, and we each tend to sort of default to one of 5 behavioral patterns in conflict. I mean, intuitively, you know about yourself. I'm speaking to the audience here. You know that you tend to be more competitive in conflict. You just want to go get what you want, and others of you are thinking that I tend to accommodate others. I tend to give in easily. And some of you might feel, well, I always try and find what's best for everyone. And those are your intuitive responses to conflict, your conflict mode. Anakin's conflict mode is competition all the way through. Anakin competes. In fact, he sees every interaction as a conflict situation and competes in all of them. And it doesn't matter whether he's actively fighting Count Dooku, so he treats it like a fierce competition, or whether he's responding to Obi-Wan as his teacher, or to Padme as his love interest or significant other. He's always trying to one-up them, to put them down, to get a jab in. So his whole mode of interaction is competition. Now, naturally, that is well suited to certain situations, and it's really not well suited to other situations. So that's why I think that it's not so much whether he's good at conflict or bad at conflict. He's not so good at making intentional decisions at how I want to be in a particular conflict, and instead he always defaults to his competitive mode.
Okay, so that's so interesting. So we see an example of Anakin's sort of defaulting to this competitive mode, I would say, as Noam just put out, when he gets denied that title of Jedi Master. Mm-hmm. So Anakin gets pretty salty when he doesn't get what he thinks he deserves. Competitive people are frequently this way. They want to get the thing that they think that they deserve. They're very interested in their own interests, right? They're very committed to getting their interests. Was there a better way to respond? Scott, what do you think? When he gets denied the rank of master, what would be a piece of advice you give him?
Well, I think Anakin really struggles from, like we all would in that same situation, that this was unjust and not deserved. He sits on the council, and Anakin really, maybe a lot based on his age and where he is in life, but he fails to really play the long game at this point. He fails to understand the dynamics of what's going on in the Jedi Council, the Republic, and how he's fitting in. So I would say he needs to exercise some patience, think about what his own interests are in the long term. And I can say, as a longtime federal employee, it's not uncommon for what your actual role is to have it take time for your actual rank and grade to catch up to that role.
What about that, Noam? Do you have anything to add in terms of advice for Anakin?
I think that's great advice, and I think it's sort of ironic because immediately or a little before that, when they had been on General Grievous's ship, and they got caught in these rays, and Obi-Wan asked Anakin, what are we going to do now? And Anakin said, I say patience. I mean, he was already at the stage where he was counseling patience to others, but he wasn't able to bring it. If I could add maybe one other idea of what he might do, it would be, sit down, Skywalker, but before you sit down, it's still fair to say, I'm accepting this for now because I respect and appreciate you all, but I want you to know that this is not serving my interests. I don't see it as fully satisfactory to me, and I hope we get to the point where we rediscuss this pretty soon. So even though you are, you're not competing with what has been decided against you, you are at least sharing where you stand, like Lando does in Solo, right? Where he gets squeezed by Beckett, and then he says to Beckett, "How was it? Like, I don't like it, I don't agree with it, but I accept it."
I accept it.
So express your opinion and then accommodate.
Then again, there's the option Anakin ultimately takes. He goes off and gets what he thinks is a better position as a Sith apprentice.
He leaves, yeah.
Right.
He traded up, yeah.
It is funny how Anakin, if he would have had a little more perspective on the broader situation, sort of the broader politics of what was going on, I think he might have not taken it so personally, because the part of the issue is that he takes it like as a direct jab, when I think in reality what the council was doing was trying to stave off Palpatine's influence, and so they were trying to disempower Palpatine's spy, to the council. So it's if he could have seen more of that kind of wrangling instead of seeing it all as about him and about whether or not he was good enough, he might have had, not that would have made it easier to not get what you wanted, but at least you would understand why not be so perhaps resentful or angry about it. Anyway.
Well,
That's a good point. He's caught in the middle of somebody else's conflict. It's not right. Ultimately, it's not his fight. It's Palpatine struggling with the Council for control over the Jedi Order.
But back to the point about conflict styles. That's actually what you would expect to see, where somebody has that very competitive style, because it's a very win-lose mentality, right?
That's right.
If you're not getting what you want, and you're losing, and you see it as a loss, and then that loss becomes very personal. Whereas if you have a more collaborative style, you might be able to accept a short-term loss for a longer-term gain.
That's right. It's one of the big downsides of that competitive style, is that inability to have that tunnel vision that you get.
Right.
Awesome. All right. So let's, we're giving advice. Now, while we're giving some advice, let's look at one of the fiercest disputes in the sequel trilogy, the conflict between Poe and Vice Admiral Holdo. So, as you remember, in The Last Jedi, when the First Order is chasing the Resistance and Leia has fallen unconscious after her incredible space flight, Vice Admiral Holdo takes command. We, the audience, have only just been introduced to her, and Poe seems to know nothing about her. He asks her about her plan to escape the First Order. She brushes him back, saying that it's not his concern. He gets increasingly worried and pushy. She gets increasingly annoyed and authoritative. Finally, he decides to stage a mutiny, which is actually, in terms of both conflict theory and the military, a pretty big deal, right? So, Sherrill, we were talking before, you and I were talking before about workplace conflicts. Can you say more about what makes this dispute between Poe and Holdo particularly thorny?
Well, wow. So, fast forward to the end a little bit. So when he finally gets knocked out, one of the things that he gets stunned, Leia shows up and stuns him. And Poe and Holdo are standing over him, and they're like, basically they both agree they like him, right? There's something about him that they like, even though he's been fighting with them and they've been fighting with him the whole time. So rewind this back. So this all starts because he's got this strategy for this bombing run, right? And the bombing run doesn't work. And he's kind of staked, they lose the whole bombing fleet, right? So he's staked something. This was, if you think of it in a workplace conflict, this is his big project, right? This is his chance to impress the boss with his big idea. This is his thing, and it fails, right? And so then the boss, not surprisingly, says, you're demoted. This is bad for you. This is bad for business. And then so when Leia gets knocked out, right? That creates this kind of unease, right? This sort of power vacuum, if you will. For those of you that work places where you get an interim boss, right? Well, there's an opportunity maybe for you to shine again to this person. And he didn't really know her. But so what makes this particularly problematic is, so he goes with his big ideas to Vice Admiral Holdo, and she shoots him down. And not only does she shoot him down, she reminds him of his embarrassment. Right? Isn't the last thing Leia did to demote you, Captain? You know, and she just sort of just go away. So you don't need to know what's going on. It's kind of the message that he gets. So she in effect insults him. So what happens then? So then he goes and creates this sort of sub plan. Well, and so back to workplace conflict. When you don't know what's going on, the boss doesn't tell you. You start filling in your own plan. You create these two separate worlds, right? So you're not talking to them, they're not talking to you, and the way this plays out here ultimately is his plan, which is this sort of secret plan off to go find the code breaker, that ends up not working, and then Holdo's plan is to abandon ship. Well, when he finally finds out that it's to abandon ship, he just sort of loses his mind because he sees this as kind of a violation. This all has to do with people who respect one another, but don't respect one another enough to communicate, right? I don't trust you, so I'm not going to tell you stuff. He doesn't tell, in fact, he even says at one point, this is a need to know plan, and she doesn't need to know, which is effectively what he's told her. So that in a workplace situation, especially where people are relying on each other, in this case, literally for their survival, there's and there's no communication, stuff goes haywire. So that's why this is particularly nasty, because it's threatening and it's endangering the lives of thousands of people.
So obviously, things could have been done differently. I think we would all agree. For example, what could people have done differently here?
Poe could stop mansplaining, for one. He just walked into the room and started doing that. And by the time he got to asking questions instead of making statements, Holdo wasn't there to listen to it anymore. Her response was to respond in the personal, and that's why this whole conversation was so personalized, and no one was able to step out of it. And if Poe would have done something different, he might have been able to sort of try to refocus every time she called him flyboy and she called him other things, to try and say, yeah, but that's, but other people are worried, other people are concerned, everybody needs to go to the plan. He tried to do this occasionally. It was too little too late. And he wasn't very good at it, because essentially he had triggered some of those personalized dynamics. One thing he could have done on that, he could have sent someone else who isn't him to speak with Holdo. Clearly his face and attitude were triggering her. It's so hard, sort of, we spoke earlier about, this isn't about me. It's so hard to remember that when you're in conflict. It's always about me. So he wasn't in any space to say, well, let's find a more diplomatic way to do it. Let's send in 3PO to explain this to Holdo.
To counter that, so in this sense, Holdo is the boss, right? And bosses and leaders need to hold themselves to a higher standard and not be triggered by somebody, especially somebody who's just been demoted, who shouldn't even be talking to you. She could have politely listened to him and said, thank you for your input, and gone on about her day. He would have at least been validated at that moment and might not have gone off and cooked up this whole other plan. So sometimes leaders, as painful as it might be for us, we kind of have to take the high ground in a conflict, because if we don't, then we create this knock-on effect, this terrible situation. And to add to that, it didn't hurt to tell everybody the plan. Eventually, they were going to have to load everybody on the ship anyway. It seemed that she had this little select group of people that she was sort of keeping as an inner circle, and no one else needed to know. So
I'm a little bit less critical of her in that sense, because I think women leaders face a different set of problems, especially with male subordinates, because again, he was mansplained her, he was treating her with disrespect. And I think that you can't help but be triggered by that as a woman leader. And she did have to push him away in a way where I think that if she had given him more latitude, that it just would count against her own credibility in a way that's not fair. It's not fair to women leaders to be put in that kind of situation, which I think he did.
In the book, we have there's a chapter by Deb Eisenberg who speaks about just that thing, about how a woman leader in that situation faces the kind of backlash for her actions that male leaders don't. If that hadn't been Holdo, but it had been Akbar, let's say, people said that wasn't the best idea, perhaps, under the circumstances, but wouldn't you receive that sort of all across the board backlash for what a terrible way to handle conflict.
Right. So we've got the mansplaining on the one hand, and then we've got sort of the leaders need to sort of hold themselves to a higher standard on the other and not get triggered. And whether or not that's possible, or, given the various gender dynamics at play. No,
Well,
I think you had some.
yeah. No, I
Go
say
ahead.
it's interesting too, because Leia, when Leia comes back, she supports the plan, and then everybody's fine with it. So it may be gender, it might be gender, or it could just also be a matter of who's seen as the legitimate authority in the situation, right?
Yeah.
And that was challenging for everybody. There was no sort of legitimate authority in that given situation.
Yeah. Right. And in terms of other people who might have been able to contribute, Noam had mentioned that maybe 3PO could have gone instead of.
Yeah, there were a lot of other people standing around, and nobody did anything. Certainly nobody did anything constructive. I mean, the only other person to intervene there was Leia, and she walked in and shot him. I mean, kudos for style, but when you're talking about constructive conflict engagement, that's not it. Many other of the people standing around could have done something to bring the conversation around more constructively. We have another chapter in the book is by Joe Allen and Catherine Castro and Emily Eden from the University of Utah, and they approach Star Wars from the perspective of meeting science, how people act in meetings, and these you can look at all of these situations as staff meetings. And in these staff meetings, the Rebel Alliance, they suggest they tend to be much more cooperative and much more collaborative in their meetings. And here, this meeting is very much an anomaly in that perspective. That this was not a typical Rebel Alliance. This looked exactly like a dark side meeting, if you ask me. And I think that particularly one of the bystanders might have taken a step back and say, hold on, this isn't how we do business. Sort of, let's all take a deep breath and talk a bit about process. How do we want to hold this conversation? Because we're one step away from force choking each other. Okay, that's just my hot take.
Well, and then just to underscore what Hillary said again, it seems sometimes like the standards for women leaders and men leaders tend to be different. They were in a pretty dire situation, conflict situation. So, well, anyway, let's cap this one for now, because I think there's a lot more to say about Poe v. Holdo. It's a really interesting conflict. It's got so many layers. And I know there's a lot of reaction to it among the fandom. I really appreciate this discussion too, because it's a really good reminder that in conflict, there's often just not one person to blame. A better frame, we often say, is contribution. So, which means that different people contributed to what is now the conflict in various ways. And some people might contribute more, some people might contribute less, some people might be making it better or worse. But it's good to remember that there are all these different inroads to the conflict, because then there's lots of different strategy points for dealing with it. But anyway, moving on, changing gears. Let's talk briefly about The Mandalorian. So, soon to be in season 3. The Mandalorian has certainly had a lot to deal with when it comes to conflict and negotiation. Noam, I know you're a huge Mandalorian fan. And in fact, for everybody's watching, Noam has just written a chapter for a new book about Star Wars, a different book about Star Wars, not our book, but it's the newest Star Wars and Philosophy volume. And in his chapter, he focuses on the Mandalorian. The Mandalorian's motto is "This is the way," as we know. And we see that this sort of sounds like an approach that might try to avoid conflict. This is the way. So there's nothing really to argue about. This is it. I guess that could create conflict, but it definitely avoids gray area. But we know that, it doesn't prevent conflicts. Noam, talk to us a little bit about a way-related conflict that the Mandalorian found himself in, and whether you think he handled it well.
Great. So I appreciate the opportunity for a shout out to our friends at the Pop Culture and Philosophy and the Star Wars and Philosophy projects and the book. One scene that I kept coming back to, both from the philosophical perspective, but also straight out from a conflict perspective, is the scene where Mando squares off with Cobb Vanth, the Marshal of Mos Pelgo, and he squares off with him over the Mandalorian armor that Cobb Vanth has. And just remember, this happens at the beginning of season 2. After Mando has spent the whole of season 1 learning that that you need to form relationships with others, that you can resolve conflict without disintegrating people, and that there's a great deal of interdependence between people you just happen to meet along the way, and that forming those bonds keep you and keep the child safe. And yet when he bumps into Cobb Vanth, he's looking for his Mandalorian cohort, and he realizes that Cobb Vanth he's not a Mandalorian. And he's probably triggered by his disappointment. Often in conflict that happens. We think a situation is one thing, the other party doesn't give us what we want or turns out not to be who we think they are. And that just triggers us, maybe even hijacks us. And in that moment, Mando forgot everything he had learned and taught himself, and that Quill had taught him and others had taught him about how you work together with people. And so the only way he could see to resolve this issue was a duel. And it's strange, and this was fueled by his instincts. It was fueled by the way he was on autopilot. He saw a non-Mandalorian Beskar, and his reaction was, I'm gonna defend the way with extreme prejudice. I'm gonna shoot that guy, that nice, easygoing guy with the great hair who had just bought me a spatchka. Instead of listening to him for a minute, I'm just gonna shoot him. And Cobb Vanth kept trying to talk him down. He said, like, maybe we could do this some other way. Like, are we going to do this in front of the kid? Trying to point at other interests that Mando might have, and he wasn't listening to anything. And it's really interesting how this got resolved. In our own world, research on peace processes has shown that very often in enduring conflict, particularly between societies or countries, things don't get resolved for years, but after some sort of a natural disaster, like a drought or a devastating hurricane, suddenly peace processes get either reinvigorated or ignited after both sides have experienced this great natural external phenomena. And I think that's just what happened in that situation. The Krayt Dragon shows up, threatening the town, posing the danger of a bigger fish, right, to everybody. And after seeing that scary, threatening phenomenon, there's like a moment in which our own little conflict seems a little smaller, and it also seems to be something we can talk about. And once that had happened, Cobb Vanth was able to engage Mando, and he brought him inside. And that's when they reach that sort of win-win discussion in which everybody walks out of it alive. Mando will help Cobb Vanth to slay the Krayt Dragon, and in return, Cobb Vanth will give up the Mandalorian armor without a fight or without the necessity of Mando murdering someone. And this solution is good for everyone, except for the Krayt Dragon, right?
Well, it's a nice tie back to sort of the discussion we had of Anakin and being unable to see the external kind of situation, but the Mando being able to see it at the Mandalorian being able to see it at that moment. Season 3 is coming. Does anybody have anything they're watching for? Noam, do you have stuff you're looking for in season 3?
Well, there are the conflicts that the narrative has set up already. I can't wait. Like there's probably a conflict between Mando and Bo-Katan, who has, they've allied together, but now Bo-Katan is going to try and figure out a way to pry the dark saber from preferably his cold, lifeless fingers. And there's perhaps between Mando and his covert, who he's tried to rejoin. They've rebuffed him in the Book of Boba Fett. And not to mention, he's bound to get into conflict with that little scampy Mandalorian Jedi that he's raising. If I could give Mando a word of advice heading into all of these conflicts, it's to keep remembering that all of the good things that have happened to him recently are a result of his ongoing increasing skill in forming strong relationships with people. He's really learning that wars not make one great.
Right.
And that you need to find other ways. You need to form alliances. You need to really work on your negotiation, communication, and conflict resolution skills in order to keep relationships moving along smoothly, in order to have each other's back, like he had with, protecting Boba Fett at the risk of his own life at the end of the book of Boba Fett. And I just hope he continues doing that and remembering how much good that does for him, for the whole village that he's built, this whole virtual village,
Right.
and how much it serves the protection of the child, which is his core life mission.
Great. Does anybody else? That's a great answer.
What do you think, Jen?
Well, for my part, I'm interested to see, again, this is a Book of Boba Fett spoiler, whether Luke respects Grogu's choice to be with the Mandalorian. So this is sort of one of those tensions between your individual life and sort of the community. It's one thing to think about giving an individual agency and autonomy and choice, but it's another to take the broader view of the benefit and risk to the larger community and the galaxy even. Is it wise to leave Grogu untrained? That could be a real problem, down the road. If you've seen the Clone Wars, you know that the Yoda was not immune to the temptations of the dark side. So that's something. Whether or not there's a responsibility there that's separate from Grogu's choice is, I think, a very interesting central conflict.
Yeah.
But okay, so moving on. Let us move on to something all people love: judging. So what we want to do is look at a few classic decisions from the original trilogy and say whether we thought they were good or bad from the perspective of conflict theory. So we're not, just to be clear, we're not saying who was right or wrong. We're not explaining why the decisions made sense from the perspective of the plot. We're just providing analysis of the choices from conflict and resolution viewpoint. So we've picked 3. Let's see. Sherrill, I'm going to start with you. Han shot first. This is from A New Hope. This is a very famous
Yes.
scene, very controversial.
Yep.
Was it a good move or a bad move? What do you think?
So controversial. In fact, they've filmed it 3 different ways. So which version are we talking about? So let's talk with the classic one where Han did shoot first, right? So Greedo, who is a bounty hunter, comes and sits down in the cantina. He's basically there to collect the bounty that Jabba the Hutt has set out for Han Solo. And there's a conversation, and while the conversation is going on, you see Han sort of slowly unclipping his blaster under the table and holding it on Greedo, and then before Greedo has a chance to shoot him, he shoots Greedo. That's the kind of the basic setup. So now, is it a good move or a bad move? I mean, strictly from a strategic point of view, it probably was good, right? Because Greedo was probably going to shoot him because he already said he'd take him dead or alive. From a peaceful conflict resolution perspective, there may have been other ways to deal with Greedo. There may have been better ways to go and deal directly with Jabba, which we see later, even after Greedo has been fried, I think is the term. So I'm interested to hear what everybody else has to say, because there's so many different opinions on this. What happened and what happened, and good or bad.
All right, I'm going to give you a different opinion. I think it's just right that Han shot first.
Huh.
And I think this is what economists would call game theory. It's just a whole field within economics, this idea of this balance between cooperation and competition. And there's this classic decision-making game called the prisoner's dilemma. And the idea here is if you have 2 parties and they have to choose whether to cooperate or compete, the promised land is when they both cooperate, but in each case, they're better off as an individual if they compete. And Han was just playing the game right. When you are talking about a long-term working relationship, that's where trust comes in and where cooperation comes in. But if it's one time and the stakes are super high like this, the right answer, and this is what the economists say, the right answer is compete. So good thing he shot first, and he might not have lived to tell the story if he hadn't gone for it.
Hillary, I want to stick with you. Let's think about Empire Strikes Back. You wrote about the Empire Strikes Back in our book, and you focused on the deal that Lando makes with Vader. We know that Vader changes the terms of that deal a few times. I'm altering the deal. Pray I don't alter it any further. Was this a good move or a bad move in your view?
Yeah, he changes the deal 3 times. And this is what we talk about in our chapter. Changing it once, changing it twice, but the third time really becomes a problem. When Han arrives with Leia and Chewbacca in Cloud City, that Lando's there taking them in as a friend, but it turns out Darth Vader gets there first and makes Lando a deal he can't refuse, which is to keep the Empire out of here forever, right? Is how Lando describes it. And it's by using the group as bait to get Luke Skywalker to come, right? And Lando has no relationship to Luke Skywalker. It doesn't bother him. But then the deal gets changed first by Darth Vader takes Han, right? Freezes him in carbonite. And Lando's very upset about this, but what can he do? He starts to object, but that's when, pray tell I don't alter the deal further. And he can live with that. He's forced to live with it. He doesn't want to. But then the second part of the deal being changed was that Leia and Chewie would not leave Cloud City, that they would stay. And there, Lando's probably actually kind of happy about it because he's enjoying Leia's company. I mean, this is not the end of the world. But Vader just goes one step farther, changes the deal a third time, which was that Leia and Chewbacca would come with him. And at that point, Lando just says no. And the problem here is that when you think about what does power mean in a negotiation, and when we talk about this as academics, we usually define power as how good your alternatives are if the deal falls through. So in this case, Vader has a lot of power because he has great alternatives, right? If Lando doesn't make a deal with him, he can have entanglements, right? He can try to tax or shut down the mining operations. And so he has a lot of power, but the problem is that there comes a point where the calculation changes because at first, Lando's still better off. Okay, the deal gets changed. Lando's still better off. The deal gets changed still. But then the third time, no, you know what? At this point, my no deal alternative is bad, but this is bad too. And so you rebelling against the Empire does not look very attractive at first. But by the third change, you know what? Rebelling against the Empire, as bad as it is, this is bad too. And Vader loses. He played his power one step too far. So would have been good the first 2 times, but then in the end it fell apart. His interests were not served in the end.
Right. It's a really good example of what we saw Anakin doing before too, just failing to sort of read the room and realize the impact of his actions. That's excellent. So, okay, so that was A New Hope. That was Empire Strikes Back. Let's look at Return of the Jedi. We have a real life judge in our group. So lucky. So Scott, near the beginning of Return of the Jedi, Luke pulls a blaster on Jabba. Talk to us about what was going on in that scene, and then tell us whether or not you think that was a good or a bad move.
So Luke enters Jabba's palace right from the start in kind of a manipulative manner. He uses the Jedi mind trick to get Bib Fortuna to bring him to Jabba the Hutt against Hutt's direct orders. His first inclination is to attempt to use the Jedi mind trick to get Jabba to release Solo. And when it doesn't work, because Jabba is strong-minded, Luke defaults into pulling his blaster and shooting up the place. And I think Luke's whole approach here reminds me very much of his father from Revenge of the Sith. Luke is coming in, he's brash, he's arrogant, he's reminding Jabba constantly, do not underestimate my power. It is your last chance to surrender when he's about to push him into the Sarlacc. But Luke really loses sight that Jabba's not without a grievance. Solo did dump his cargo. He owed him money that he did not repay. He was given a warning and second chance that I will give you this at the original New Hope and the additional scene. I'll give you another chance, but you have to pay me or I'm sending the bounty hunters after you. So often Luke's approach is Jabba is not addressed, and Luke also shows a lot of lack of good faith. He's smuggled in a lightsaber, he's got a gun, he's manipulating, but he's never attempting to truly see if there's a way to work something out with Jabba.
I don't think
Yes.
I don't think he planned to be acting in good faith. I really liked his strategy of pulling the blaster, and I liked it for maybe a different reason, which was that I think sometimes in negotiation and conflict, you actually want to lull your opponent into complacency by looking weak, looking like an idiot sometimes. And it's like I mentioned earlier with the car that Yoda's going to get underestimated because he's short and green. Sure. Luke is getting underestimated because he's doing something really stupid, right? So it's not just that he's doing something that's in bad faith; he's just doing something that's dumb, right? So he pulls out a weapon that it has no chance, right? So he looks like he does not have good skills, right? That the other side thinks poorly. Jabba looks at him and says, he's got one lousy weapon that's easily disarmed. So then Jabba's thinking, well, who would think that he has the best weapon ever made, and he's holding that thing back, and he's got that up his sleeve. And then Jabba's so overconfident that he goes out to the desert, right? He's willing to leave his palace where he's vulnerable outside and go out to the desert, and it's because he never saw it coming that wait, there's a lightsaber hidden in the droid who was given to me as a gift. So I actually thought it was a great idea in the end to pull the blaster.
I gotta say, I always wondered what was the original plan, right? Because he did not intend to end up in the Rancor pit. At what point was R2 supposed to give him the lightsaber? Like, it all turned out well in the end, but when you think through it as a strategic decision,
Actually, you point a good point. It is almost this point. It seems like his plan could have gone off the rails because he must have had inside information that Jabba's favorite way to dispose of his captives is to throw them in the Sarlacc pit. So that would be the perfect time to shoot out the lightsaber. But then Jabba decides to dump him into a pit and try to kill him first outright.
Maybe he read the screenplay before walking into Jabba's palace.
Certainly he prepared himself, which is what we would all say all good negotiators should do.
right.
Okay, well, that's awesome.
Preparation.
That's right, preparation. Super interesting. So, all right, so moving on. The big event of the summer was Kenobi. And Noam and I spent a lot of time thinking and blogging about this particular series. The reception of the series has been somewhat mixed, and it really benefits y'all from more than one watch, as you know. So, Noam, for people rewatching the series, what one thing should they look for? There might be more things, but what is one thing you think they should look for in terms of conflict resolution and negotiation?
In Kenobi, at last, we see a Jedi who's really forced to negotiate and resolve conflict, just like the rest of us do it. In the first 2 or 3 episodes, he's either unwilling or unable to engage with the Force, so he doesn't use Obi-Wan doesn't use any Jedi mind tricks or any slick moves. He has to negotiate, and he's not at his best, and he has like these feeble negotiations that he's less successful in. If you remember his confrontation with the meatpacking foreman, his feeble argument with Owen about whether Luke would be trained, his clumsy interactions with the stormtroopers on Frick's pickup truck or pickup speeder. He's trying his best to develop those persuasive skills and those communicative skills when he's not at his best and when he can't draw on the Force. And I think that speaks to all of us. And when you think about even later when he does have the Force as his ally, he still doesn't enjoy the stature that Jedis used to enjoy. He can't dictate terms. He can't bring everybody to follow him just because he's General Kenobi leading the parade. It doesn't work that way anymore. The Jedi are outcast, they're downtrodden, they're dependent on volunteers. So even when he needs all of those volunteers to allow him to go confront Darth Vader for that final confrontation, he needs to persuade them. In the Clone Wars, he would have said, here's the plan, and not asked anyone. But now he needs to persuade them, just like the rest of us.
Yeah.
He needs to read the room, as we've been saying.
Mm-hmm.
He needs to understand what the multiple interests are, and he needs to find how to connect with people in a way that will allow him to get what he needs. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, those are all excellent points. There's as far as negotiation, there's a great scene with the third sister, right? So the they're at the door. They're going to break in, and he's got the third sister kind of on her own, and he's got a sort of a one-on-one negotiation with her. And at first, it appears what he's trying to do is he's trying to delay. He's trying to create delay tactics so they can get their forces together, so they can defend themselves as best they can, or hopefully to escape. But then, as he kind of figures out who she is, right, he then appeals to her interests. You're actually here to get Vader. So he sort of in sort of our negotiation and conflict resolution lingo, he sort of brings her onto his side of the table. So it stops being a delay tactic and more kind of a speed up, let's get him in here so you can deal with him tactic, because she's actually powerful enough to be able to manage that. So that's a real key moment as far as watching that. It's great when you're talking to people and you realize that you actually share a common interest. You've got something that you can discuss, then you can work together. That brings a whole new energy to
It's a game changer. Yeah.
Yep.
And I think Kenobi is very consistent with his portrayal throughout the Star Wars saga. So we always see him kind of use the Force in very defensive ways. So, these aren't the droids you're looking for, scaring off Tusken Raiders, getting stormtroopers to kind of go the opposite direction, the Death Star. But when it comes to conflict and negotiation, Obi-Wan approaches people with a great deal of respect. He doesn't try to manipulate them or use the Force over them. He tries to kind of, as you're pointing out, Sherrill, with the third sister, that's innate skill he has of being a good listener, empathizing, trying to build those bridges.
Yes. So
about what you're saying is that when you think about when you negotiate, you need to have a different strategy for different people. There's a lot of research about what's the ideal strategy in negotiation, and all of it just comes out as a big goose egg. There is no ideal strategy. The ideal strategy matches your counterparties, and I just love that description of how you phrase that, because he understands the weak counterparties get the Jedi mind tricks, but the parties he respects, he treats them with respect back, and I think that kind of style matching is a real strength of his.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. So like I said, Noam and I have been blogging about this, and I really invite everybody else on this panel to blog with us, because it would be great. We're going to blog about Andor when it comes out too, among other things, at our book's website, which is right here on the screen. If you go to our website, just by the way, you can sign up to be notified when our book is published on Star Wars and conflict resolution. So please check it out. Okay, we've now come to one of the most central questions in Star Wars and perhaps in life. Sith or Jedi? So this is certainly one of the questions that a lot of our authors asked in our book. The Sith and Jedi have very different approaches to conflict, to put it mildly, and to negotiation, to put it mildly. Sherrill indeed wrote a chapter on this very question.
Yes.
And so, Sherrill, before we leave our rundown, I want to ask you, it's clear that the light and the dark side are not the same when it comes to conflict. It's less obvious, but which one is better, right? So which one is better? Which approach is better? So can you talk a little bit about, is one approach more effective than the other? What is your thinking on that?
Well, I'll start with this. So Darth Vader's lightsaber, right? The red.
Wow.
Okay, we'll talk about seeing red in a minute, as opposed to, and I always keep ObiWan Kenobi's lightsaber nearby. It's because it's super cool, but it's blue, right? It's cool. And that's one of the things, and I know there's actually a chapter about lightsabers and color
There
and
is.
style. So I will let you all discuss that in more depth, or hopefully you'll read more about it in the book. But effectively, the Sith style is one of heat. It is one of passion. It is one of you want to use your energy for your benefit, for your purpose. It's about gaining power, right? The Jedi style is supposed to be and often is more. It's introspective, but it's introspective for the benefit of others, right? So the point of the Jedi are supposed to be selfless. They love, but they love everybody. That's how they access the Force. It's through that love. And through that compassion. And that's kind of the basic difference. Now, what does that mean? We've already talked a little bit about this. What does that mean in terms of what's better, what's worse? It kind of depends on the style. But I think importantly, we have access to both of these things. So in my chapter, we talk about neurochemistry and how your body is wired for both the light and the dark. So I know the midichlorians still are controversial, but if we replace midichlorians with neurotransmitters, and let's talk in our universe, not the Star Wars universe, you can see that. So what looks like Sith are things like cortisol and adrenaline, the fight, flight, and freeze. That anger it gives you energy, right? When you're angry and you're frustrated, and you need that energy sometimes to resolve a dispute. Where the Jedi mode would associate more with oxytocin, mirror neurons, which are ways that you sort of help calm. If I'm calm and you're looking at me, and that helps make you calm. These are all kind of Jedi traits, if you will. But so what works? It depends. It's a terrible answer, but it depends on the given situation. If you ask me, I mean, it's going to be both, and we ultimately see this with Rey. By the time we get to sort of episodes 8 and 9, that it's this combination of the two thing. It's the calm connection to that you have with yourself and to the other, and then using that energy you might get from what looks like the dark side that drives you to be able to resolve conflicts, right? So you can sit very passively, as Qui-Gon did, and meditate, but when you're meditating, you're sort of locking yourself out from the rest of the world. You got to take that calmness and then do something with it.
All right, well, so we're kind of at the end of time here, so let's think about one final question before we wrap it up. We've been talking about Star Wars today from the perspective of our expertise. But obviously, we were all fans first before we started studying conflict and negotiation. What is one thing that you have learned from Star Wars that you've taken with you to your work on negotiation and conflict resolution? I will start with Scott.
Thanks, Jen. Kind of building on what I was saying about Sith and Jedi and hardball negotiations, I now find myself in real life looking across the room at a party who is, pounding the table. I had one recently must quit the mediation like 6 times, and thinking, oh well, I'm not weak-minded. I will just kind of blow past you and defuse your hardball negotiations because they're very weak once you call them. And at the same time, it's flipped my Star Wars viewing. So I'm like, hey, wait a minute, the Jedi, they're not so good after all when they're trying to manipulate, and when Qui-Gon's trying to get the parts from Watto for worthless Republic credits. So it's kind of changed my view a little bit, both of them.
That's great. How about you, Hillary?
I think for me, so I was just a little kid when Empire Strikes Back came out, and I was struck that power can be taken too far. And we think that it's good to have power, but ultimately you need to leave enough for others that they want to play with you. They need to work along, and that I think power can tempt you just to squeeze people to the breaking point. But in a negotiation, if all you have is a piece of paper that has a list of favorable deal terms that you squeezed out of somebody else, then you've actually lost.
That's great. Sherrill.
Failure. I think this is sort of Force Ghost Yoda's final word on the subject of being a Jedi, so to accept your failures. It's very easy, especially when you're working with people in long-term disputes. I've worked with people in parenting coordination, and I've worked with neighborhood disputes. I've worked with family businesses, and it's really easy after you have one interaction with somebody that doesn't work to want to give it up and throw it all away. But you got to work with folks to say, hey, that didn't work that well that time. Let's go back and try it again. Let's try something new. Until you can get people to reflect on the wins and the losses and accept that sometimes it doesn't work out, it's really hard to get things resolved in the long term. So accepting that it's not always going to work. I think that's hard for parties. It's also hard for mediators. We don't like to fail either. So just accepting that failure, and that's what Yoda would say. Failure is the greatest teacher of all.
How about you, Noam?
Well, episode 1 came out literally just as I was beginning to study conflict and negotiation. And I remember this formative moment that stayed with me ever since, this moment when, in the midst of a fierce battle with Darth Maul, Qui-Gon Jinn suddenly kneels and begins meditating to replenish himself and draw on the Force while he has this short respite in the middle of the battle. And that's stuck with me ever since. We need to take these moments. We can get lost in conflict. It's so easy to get lost and just to respond, react. But if you take a moment to consider, to refocus, what am I about in this conflict? Who am I? Why am I here? And what do I need? Sort of reconnect to ourselves and to our energy, and then come back to the table. We'll act differently, and we'll do ourselves a better service. that's been my ally for the past 4 years.
That's wonderful. So my answer to this question is, I loved all your answers. My answer is to never give up on someone, even if it's someone you hate, even if it's someone you think is evil and you think that person can never be different. Star Wars reminds us that everyone is capable of redemption and everybody can change. So we have Han, we have Lando, we have Darth Vader, we have Kylo Ren. Of course, we do have Emperor Palpatine, and who knows about him, but maybe he could change too if you
Somehow.
give him a little more time. Yeah. So anyway, with that brings us to the end of our session. We hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you'll stay in contact with us around these and other issues, especially as Andor comes out and then our book is published. Thanks very much to the Dragon Con organizers, especially Brandy and everyone at Star Wars Dragon Con. I hope everybody has a great Dragon Con this year, and may the Force be with you.